Welcome back to another episode of the Pandemic Interview Series. Today, I'm talking to a lady by the name of Perica Lopez, or Mariana Lopez. Perica is her nickname. Perica ran a club down in Mexico with her brother. Then she moved up here and got married and now studies historic martial arts up here in the U.S. And today we're going to talk to her about her experiences as a woman studying historic European martial arts, as well as a founder of a group called F&Gs. So I've been really looking forward to having you here, and thank you so much for joining us. Perica, I've known you for several years, and I've watched you grow both as a fencer and as just doing so many different things, and I'm really excited to have you here with me.
Thank you so much. I mean, you're one of the very first people that I met from not Mexico, and you helped tons in my progress. So like having this chat with you is actually really exciting.
Well,
thank you for having me.
To hear. I've got a lot of questions I want to ask you, but with martial artists, I'd like to start here. When did you start studying martial arts, and what styles have you studied?
So that's actually kind of like a tricky question, because what happened is my brother has done martial arts from a really, really young age. He's done Taekwondo and karate. He's done judo, I think judo. So what happened is he was really into martial arts. I was into other stuff. Like I used to do running and cheerleading. And I started getting the bug of martial arts because of him. And I did karate for a little bit, didn't get the hang of it. Then I did Taekwondo for about, I think, 2 years. It didn't also went great. And I just couldn't find a martial art that will make me sort of happy, to say it, until I found sword fighting.
Oh, that's
so
fantastic.
I try things, but I never stick to one enough to say that I practice it. And after Hema, I did try a little bit of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Didn't work because of schedule, but I usually don't say that I practice other martial arts because I never stuck to it long enough for it to matter, if that makes sense.
And it's interesting the words that you use, and you didn't stick to them because you just didn't get it or it was hard, but it didn't make you happy. And that's a really neat way to look at it, because it is the 21st century. None of us are living or dying by these arts.
Yeah.
Here. So we don't need to do it for life or death purposes for the most part.
Yeah.
There are some that do. We do not.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was also like the format alone. It just felt like a very, like, personally, I used to have a lot of issues with authority, as they say, and it was kind of like rubbing to like a very like strict thing, and probably now I would be able to handle it, but also I think it was not kind of like the age and time for me to do that kind of activities. But it was interesting because thanks to that is that I was so excited with fencing. So probably without that journey, I would have not even paid attention to the idea of fighting with swords.
Very cool. And when did you start studying sword fighting and Hema?
That's another complicated question. No, it's not complicated. So I discovered Hema when I was 16 years old. And so what happened is we found a manual. We had a friend who introduced us to Fiore, and
good choice.
We kind of fidgeted with the idea. So I started training back when I was 16, 17. It was 2000. Oh, I'm not good with numbers. 2006, 2007, maybe, probably earlier than that. And that's what I started with, but I don't know if it counts as properly studying the sources, because I don't think we were really sure what we were doing. So that's what I pretended I did. I will flash forward to 4 more years to actually think that I was actually properly working with manuals and stuff.
Yeah, I remember when I started doing sword stuff. It was 1989, and I was touring around California doing armored tournaments at Renaissance fairs. And I had that feeling like you're talking about right now. But I remember one of the guys in the group, he said to me, "This is your third tournament. You're a veteran." Because I had more experience than the people that were doing it before. So I think, and this is important for a lot of people to hear, we don't always have somebody to go study with. But the
Yeah,
desire to start delving into that information, that's when it starts. So I'd say you started then.
that's a good point.
And give yourself credit. That's one of the hardest things for a lot of us is to not recognize the work that we put in because it wasn't good enough.
And I remember dwelling over the fact that fencers who had just 1 year fencing were understanding the sources faster than me. Like, I've been doing these for this long. And then I realized, like, well, they arrive with something already studied, and they come
Yeah.
with someone who can sort of like give them kind of like the pre-bake cake. Well, we had to start from scratch. So
Yeah.
that's true. I guess it's a matter of putting in perspective, kind
And
of
that's
like
true
the
for a
starting
lot of
point.
people, I think. It's very easy to not recognize the work that we put in and say to ourselves and to other people that ignore this because it wasn't good enough. But you were still doing it.
Yeah, that's true.
So you started with Fiore, and like I said, good choice. But what systems and weapons have you studied and worked on?
So that's actually kind of like an interesting thing. So I started with Fiore, and then flash forward. Well, technically, I pushed my brother to start with Fiore because that's the only manual that we knew of. Also, back in the day, Arma did a lot of work in terms of like manuals, and I believe Fiore was the only one that they sort of translated to Spanish. Which also makes it interesting because it's a translation of a translation from someone who's not a professional translator. So that adds to the story. So we started with Fiore, and then as the story of Hema kind of like moves forward, there was a guy who happened to know a guy who happened to be Scott Brown, who was invited to go to Mexico. And my brother went, and at that time, Scott Brown was working, I mean, he mostly works with German sources. I actually don't remember the particular one that he started with, but since he came visit, my brother decided to move forward with German sources because it sort of made a little bit more sense to him to actually work with not the translation of the translation, and the workshop of Scott Brown kind of like gave him a very good basis to move on. So we always started with longsword. The one that we stick to even after we moved to German, we always stick to Abrazare. So I used to do a lot of dagger back in the day, not as much now, which I kind of like I'm sad about, but dagger, honor army combat, and then later on we start playing with some quarterstaff. Then I discover Palo Sector Mayor, and I discover sickle, which people don't get it. It's like I hate that there's no more of it because I'm deeply in love with that weapon. I saw it using it with farmers. I used it once, and then after I learned how to chop with it, I learned that it was an actual in a manual. I just lost it. I was like, it's the best in the world. So working with Power Sector Mayor, and I mean, at this stage of I almost lost count of the things. Like I started doing. I recently started doing volleys, sword and buckler. When I moved to the U.S., I started doing ringen instead of abrazare, and I went to.
Real quick, can you tell people that don't know what abrazare and ringen are?
So abrazare is the Italian tradition of unarmed fighting, aka wrestling. And ringen is the German tradition. I think, however, that the biggest difference is that by the time period of ringen, they start also being a little bit more of a kind of like play competitive scenario. So a lot of abrazare tends to be standing techniques. Okay, I'm standing on, and I'm breaking your joints and I'm throwing you to the ground and I'm dislocating your shoulder, and I should not be smiling while saying this, but it's pretty
I
fun.
think you should.
Right? So it's a lot of like standing, playing around. Ringen also goes to start standing, right? But there's a little iffy bit more of like groundwork, like reversals and stuff like that. I guess just because it's a conversation, for those who don't know, it's also important to note that it's not like they have a lot of in the groundwork, because it's not like in judo when you keep like trying to poke the other one, mostly because usually you will have a dagger. So once you're in the ground, it's kind of like the end of your song. But yeah, that's kind of like a big rough difference, or that's how I put it at least.
Okay, that's very cool. Now, you keep mentioning that you were studying with your brother in Mexico, and you started a group with him. What was that group called? And is it still going?
Oh, so I think for that, if you don't mind, I'm gonna go a little bit back into history.
Oh, sure.
Of how it happened. So I used to do reenactments. I was looking for a martial art. My brother was already deep down in martial arts. In this tournament, we met a guy, and I literally, this is how it happened. I literally said out loud while two people were fighting with buffers, I wish sword fighting was a martial art. And I just said out to the air, and all of a sudden, this big guy behind me, I was like, well, it's actually a thing. And I was like, what? And he talked to us about Fiore and how he went to the US for some random thing of work, came up with this group of people sword fighting, approached them, talked to them, and discovered Fiore. That's literally how I arrived at it. Like the most random weird luck ever. So he showed us the manual, he gave us the sources, and with my brother having an actual background in martial arts, I essentially taunted him to form a group. It was like, look, you understand things that I don't about the human body, and you have a logic of what wrestling and fighting is about that I don't have. So these will make more sense to you than it will do to me, because you already have that kind of like martial mindset. So we always make the joke that I blackmail him to start the group. He eventually agreed, and that's how it started. So it's actually funny because on the start, he would be the one, actually for many years, he would be the one directly working with the manuals, and I will be kind of like the punching bag, kind of like hearing to his explanations. And so we started the group, and because we used to do reenactment, we actually it was a really funny group. So we had a reenactment portion, we had a Hema version, and then we had like a point in which we could try to combine it for a while, in which we will do kind of like stage sword fight. The main group was called Yggdrasil Volker because we thought it sounded cool, even if none of us could pronounce it. And it was kind of like made up. The Hema side of it, it was called Fenrir because we thought it sounded cool. Yeah. And eventually we realized that we really wanted to focus into the fencing, right? Like the reenactment was kind of like a hobby, but it's not something that I really wanted to devote ourselves to that deep level. And it was kind of like a fun activity, not more as we want to have a group for that. So we essentially, the group itself was so attached to that concept that we completely kind of like disbanded, and then we created Canon Academy. Canon is an Aztec, I mean, that's not an Aztec, Nawa word, which I thought it was kind of cool to actually have something Mexican in it rather than just apply for the European side of it. And then what happened is my brother had to move to another city for work. He's been trying to do something related there, but he hasn't really been able to because he travels from city to city very often, which makes it hard trying to run a club. Then one of our students take charge of the club, and then he won a contest and he earned a master's in Paris. So now he's in Paris, and he handed the club to another guy. At this stage, I have lost a little track of how they're doing because the constant change of management, let's say, kind of like hurt it a little bit. So I think they're kind of like in a study group kind of scenario right now. Okay. But they also changed the name because my student hated my name. So they changed the name, and then the guy who kept it later is like, I'm not happy with the name, and I think they changed the name again. So it's kind of like a funny scenario. So first said the club doesn't exist anymore, but there's people in my hometown who keep sort of like doing it, that kind of like our grandsons of the project.
It's kind of evolved.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
well,
that's actually
cool.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's actually funny, because one of my wishes when I did my club is like, I mean, I was in school, so I didn't know if I was going to stay in the city for the rest of my life. So within the beginning of the project, I knew that I wanted it to be something that could move on to someone else if necessary. So it's kind of like exciting that it sort of has been able to do that.
I've had some interesting talks with people, and quite often for instructors and people like us, that's our ultimate goal.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next question. You started studying, and then you went into competition, and you just wrote an amazing blog entry that I really enjoyed, and I'd like to refer to bits of that in just a little bit. But then you moved into competition. What are some of the challenges that you've run into while competing with the sword because you're a woman?
So justice in that's kind of like I don't want to say sensitive, like I'm really open about it, but it's not an easy talk.
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge where I come from, right? So my hometown is the most conservative state of my entire country. For those who don't know about Mexico, something like 80% of the population is Catholic. It's very diverse, so there's very open-minded Catholics, there's very conservative Catholics, but there is a very strong line of this is a male's activity and this is a woman's activity. So to give some context, the situation goes to the point that people will go to my mom to ask her, how could she allow me to train fencing? Luckily, my mom is really cool, and she told everyone to go mind their own business because her daughter was amazing. But that's kind of like the level of conflict that it causes to people for me to do fencing. So one of the issues that I would find while doing Hema was people will go to our club and they will realize that I'm teaching for the day, and they will see that I was a woman, and they will leave on the spot. Because what would a woman have to teach them, right? Or they will come and they will try to flirt on me, right? Because I was cool, and I will say no, and they will be like, well, what's the point? And they will leave. And so when I approached tournaments, it was kind of like these constant previous battle with the topic. And what happened is it was a very supportive community, because a lot of the Hema people that I started with knew me and they were very kind, but there's still a lot of, even if you're open-minded, there's a lot of things that are still in your entire education. So I started my first Hema years of competing while having people hear like screaming on the background, either hit her, is just a girl, or just ignore that she's a girl, or don't be too rude, she's just a girl. And then after the match, I will have guys being like, oh, I'm sorry, I hope I didn't hit you too hard. Or like, oh, I'm sorry, but I mean, you beat me, but I was trying to be gentle because you're a woman. There was this particular guy, which I'm not going to name, who he was fencing another girl. And he was just absurd, right? He was like, and I'm not joking, he was doing this.
Oh, condescending.
And the other girl was so confused that she followed through, and the match was a disaster, right? Like nothing happened. It was really terrible. So then I went after him, and I was really upset. It's like, you don't fence like this. Why are you moving like this to her? Like, she's here with full awareness of the consequences of getting hit with a sword. Like, it's a consent situation. I'm consenting you to hit me. It's not like in the street. Like, if you hit me, of course that's wrong. But right now, and in this spot, we both consented to what we're doing. So why are you not respecting her like you respect the rest of your opponents? And his answer was, I don't think women should do any fencing.
Mm.
In my club, women are allowed to do techniques, but they're not allowed to fight. Because that's not a female activity. Right? So I had a lot of these feedback. And I understand it was not everyone, but even if it's like the 1%, it's not something that the average person just hears when they're trying to do an activity. So it's actually interesting because that caused me to be very shy in my fencing. So people will get angry if I start beating them. People will be condescending if I start beating them. So it's actually funny because I start being afraid of defeating people.
Yeah.
So I will compete because I like competitions, but I will lose intentionally because I didn't want it to deal with the drag of it. And then that eventually led into me thinking I wasn't a good fighter and just having like the worst mental state.
And it'll snowball all the way down.
And the crazy part is that it's not this conscious of a process. Like I didn't rationalize it like this back then. It was many years of looking back when I was like, oh, this explains a lot.
That self-realization is powerful too.
And it's hard. Like one of the things, and anyone who's seen me, they have noticed that there's been a radical change of how I fight from when I was in Mexico to when I moved to the US. Some of it has to do with how much I can train, which always, like, training once a week is not the same as training 5 days a week. Like, let's put that out there for people who are like, why don't I improve that fast? But a lot of it, and it's not even when I moved here, it's when I started dating my husband. And a lot of it is because my husband started questioning me a lot on these things. And he will be like, well, we'll go to Long Point. And he will be like, why are you doing this? And it's like, why am I doing what? It's like, you just paused for no reason. And I'm like, no, I didn't. And he's like, yes, you did. And he will show me like videos, or we'll start kind of like playing into my head how I was acting, right? Or why were you fencing that person this way and not that way? And I was like, oh, but he's my friend. And he's like, so what? And I was like, I don't want them to get mad at me. And he was like, why would they get mad at you? And he started kind of like digging unintentionally. And he was just like, as it started coming up, I even remember like crying like a little girl over the topic because it just kind of like hit me. He's like,
yeah,
like, this is not cool.
that's a good coach right there.
Yes, and I don't know. I do think again, I feel like I have to clarify. It's not like the Mexican Hema community is the devil. I do want to put that out there, but it did made it really, really hard at the start, particularly when there's only like 3 girls in the entire Hema community of like 60 plus people, right? So it did made it really, really challenging, because competing was more than just trying to put myself out there for a match. It was questioning if the people out there saying that I shouldn't do this were right or not. It was questioning just the entire status quo of a woman. It was challenging the perceptions of the people in front of me. It was putting my mom in a tough spot where she has to constantly deal with people nagging her. And then it turned to add more things like, oh, I'm the only one, or I'm one of the few ones. So if I don't perform, I'm setting an example. If I don't perform, I'm proving them they're right. So you just start kind of like building these up. And that was like, and it still sort of happens to an extent. Like it's not like I just got rid of all those feelings.
Yeah.
But I think that's the biggest challenges for me to fight.
That's two things come to my mind when I hear you saying these. And one is, just like you were training in the martial arts, you were being trained to not be successful.
Yes.
And training is very difficult to overcome unless you have a coach, which you found in your husband, that can help you with that. Second thought that I had was, this is like a lot of When you went into the field to fence, you weren't only fencing this other person, you were fencing this mental and emotional abuse before you even got to that person.
Yeah.
And yet you did it. And that's really good.
Well, I've always been a stubborn. That's for sure. I've always been, because here's the other thing. Actually, this is a funny story. I've always been like, when people tell me I can't do something, I just lit fire. And one of the funny things is that I had to learn how to train out of not a challenge if you can't do it.
Yes.
It was
No,
very funny, but it was a thing.
it's almost like the words "I dare you" means I'll do anything. If you dare me to do it, I'm not going to let that stop me.
Yes, but then when no one tells you, when no one dares you ever again, it's like, oh, what's the reason to I need to find a reason again. So yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, I did have a very strong support system. My brother always was fantastic. One of my best friends, who was my very first student, he was always super supportive. And honestly, one of the reasons I didn't just drop out is because I had them. Because anytime that I will go back to my club, besides of the people who will like show up and leave because whatever, like the people who were constantly staying in my club, they were fun. And I guess this is a part of like, it doesn't make me happy. They were fun. They were a blast to fight. And they all made up, or like were overwhelmingly more than just the awfulness of it.
Yeah.
And the other thing that is kind of like rough to say is that many people are like, oh, you're really brave for dealing with this and for deciding to keep going. But the truth to be told is like, I came to the realization is like, it's not like I'm brave, it's just that I don't have an option. Because if I don't fight these in fencing, I'm going to fight it when looking for a job. And if it's not when I'm looking for a job, I'm going to fight it when trying to do something. Like whatever I pick, that challenge is going to come from somewhere. So I just picked the one that it was the most worth it for me, I guess, to go through the struggle. And swords was my answer.
That's a really important lesson for everybody. There's always going to be that challenge, and we're going to see the same challenges in our life in every aspect of our life. So if I avoid it here, there's a good chance I'm going to see it here. And if I avoid it here, I'm going to see it here.
Yeah.
So if I've got to defeat this demon, it might as well be in something that I enjoy doing.
Correct. Yes.
Nice.
100%.
That's a great answer. How has the Hema community changed over the last several years in regards to female students and competitors?
A lot. I think so. To me, one of the biggest examples is that the fact that we are now part of the market alone shows you how there's enough of us that we make an impact, right? So, of course, with the Sphinx, we gave a lot of visibility to women. I like to give it a lot of credit to my organization. I feel like it's my duty as someone who believes in what she does to give it a lot of credit to it. It might or might not have an impact. I will never know. But I think that the fact that clubs have been successful enough to start living that habit of having only one girl. Yeah. It's a huge sign of how much the community is changing. The fact that, I mean, I remember back in the day, the whole women or mixed tournaments was just, the internet was falling over it. Like when people talk about Hema drama, that was really strong Hema drama.
I remember that one.
And I mean, sure, there's still a lot of opinions about it, but I think everyone has learned that there's a place for everything. Like there's a place for mixed tournaments. There's a place for women tournaments. There's a place for beginning tournaments and advanced tournaments. But the fact that it's normalized that they're there now, the fact that places like Spes now carry a line for like women who have different measurements, the fact that makers are starting to recognize that smaller gear is important, I think that not only shows how much the community has evolved, but it also shows that there's also willingness to welcome even more people. Because it's really hard for me to welcome more women if I cannot provide them with what they need in order to fence. And I mean, I do think it's also fluctuating because sometimes people think like, oh, we solved the women in Hema situation of do we have all the support system that we need? And someone's like, yeah, we're getting better. And then someone is like, no, this is not good enough. And it's kind of like a push and pull sort of thing. But honestly, I think that as a woman, starting right now in Hema, it's radically easier. I don't think it's easy yet. I think there's a lot of, it also depends on your region and where you fall from. Now you have the issue that you have too many options to choose, so you never know which one is the best one. But I think that the simple fact that we can have these conversations show that there is being a lot of improvement. Because before there was just like, there's no place for it. Like, why would you even?
That brings up another question I have for you. And what advice would you give a woman who's interested in beginning their study in HEMA now? What advice from your experience would you give them?
My first and biggest advice is don't get discouraged because the first place that you find was not your place. There's different cultures, there's different club cultures, there's different options, and just because the first club that you went to didn't work for you doesn't mean that HEMA is not for you. It just means that that particular club is not for you. The other one that I would say is like, don't be shy about making mistakes. There's a lot of pressure because if I am doing this thing that is challenged whether I should do or not, I need to perform at best or else I'm proving them right. So as female fencers advance, I've noticed that it's very common that they start being less tolerant to making mistakes.
Yeah.
And it becomes very self-defeating and it becomes very comparing. It's like, why am I not like this guy sword fencing like this? Why am I not at this level? Why I cannot perform like this other person? These new guy just hit me. He's going to think like I'm the worst and they will just not handle that and they will drop. So I think I would be like, just don't mind the process, right? Everyone has its own rhythm. It took me, there's people who medal at 5 years of tournaments, right? It took me a good 8 years to get my first medal.
Yeah.
And 8 years of like constantly training and working and like thinking about fencing and breathing fencing and almost, it sounds terrible, smoking, but like everything, right? Like everywhere. So don't be too hard on yourself. And I guess the last advice I would do is find a support system. And this is, for example, this is one of the things that Sphinx has. Like, if you don't have a support system, there's one for you, right? We gave you the offer. You don't have to take it, but it's there. And but just find, if you're enjoying your experience at your club, but you feel like you're missing something, find that something so you don't have to quit. Don't give up too easy, I guess, is the end of the main goal of it.
And I like the way you said that just because this club doesn't fit doesn't mean that HEMA is not for you.
Correct.
There's lots of clubs out there. There's lots of people. And we all know that people are different. And I may not get along with these people, but these people are fantastic. But if I give up here, I'll never find them.
Correct.
That's my family that I'm now missing.
I guess that it's like the McDojo thing, right? Everyone who tries to do martial arts, no one stops at the first club. I mean, so if you find the great one, sure, but like everyone is aware that that might happen. Yeah. So people don't get discouraged on the start. Because our community is so small, people don't realize that there's, I'm sorry to say this, but there's McDojos out there. Right?
Several years ago, you moved to the U.S. to get married. What I'd like to ask is, what has been the biggest challenge of moving to a new country and then resuming your training?
English. Oh, God. I remember, so I mean, you've met me for many years before. I have an acceptable English, right? But it's not the same as having full-time English. So I moved here, got married. I came through the fiancé visa process. And for those who don't know, with the current political scenario. Instead of taking me a couple of months, it took me a full year to get my status arranged, which implied that I was not allowed to do anything in the US for an entire year. I was in full 1 year quarantine. So this experience is not new to me to an extent. So all I had left was fencing, and I will go fence, but I didn't know anyone. And so I needed to get to know people. And one of the suggestions was, why don't I go to the club, and instead of just fence, I'll start taking some of the classes, right? And I was like, let's do something that I'll really train. I'm gonna do rapier. So I joined Bill Grandy's, I don't remember if it was the intermediate or the advanced rapier class. And it was something like the third class, maybe. We were working on something. I believe it was Bolognese. And he picked up the manual and he opened it up and it's like, I want you guys to read this section, find a partner, and try to come up with your own thought of what that means. Then we're going to talk about it, debate it. I will give you my own interpretation of it, and then we're going to practice it, right? I was like, cool. Easy peasy. I go to the manual, and again, I used to work a lot with manuals with my brother, whose English before is better than, actually, I think up to date, his English is better than mine. I start reading, and I'm like slow reading, like going super slow, and everyone's just passing, reads, and goes to work. And everyone is going halfway through it, and I still have no idea what I'm reading, and I just went full on cultural shock, and I was feeling like so dumb. Like I was like, I'm not very smart. Like, what is happening right now? And I remember being like, Bill, I need to go to the bathroom. And I just went to the restroom and just like crying like a little girl. And he saw my face. He was like, what's happening? He's like, I just don't understand. And he will explain in class, and he will be having this dialogue stuff with swords and stuff, and I wouldn't understand half of the words. It was just awful. Because it's like, this is the one thing that I know, and I have no idea what you're saying.
Frustrating.
It was incredibly frustrating. And it was even more frustrating for me because I was used to be the translator at Hema events, and I was able to do that. But I never recognized that at Hema events, and I know now that I teach workshops, I never make that connection that you speak different than when you're casually in a class. And I was not getting lost on the terms. I was getting lost of everything in between. And it just made it really hard. So I actually ended up leaving the class, and I never came back to it. And it took me a lot of patience and practice. So I ended up joining David's class because he was also being my husband. I think in my head, he was going to be a little bit more understanding of my frustrations. And I found a way to kind of like constantly ask what he was trying to say. So at first I stopped trying to understand them, and I will just imitate everyone in what they were doing. I was like, oh, I know what this means. Of course I know how to do it. Like, I've done it always, but it kind of helped me start connecting until I was able to kind of like figure it out English to an extent that I felt comfortable, to the point that now I can teach a class.
Nice.
So I'm back to teaching.
That's fantastic. Does David speak Spanish?
He does, but no, it's not as fluent as me. Let's say that the quarantine has made him a lot more conversational in Spanish. But no, back then, like, his Spanish was really, really limited.
Yeah. I have a lot, being here in the Bay Area, I have a lot of students who are from different countries. And I'll often get people, they try to say something in English and they say it wrong. I'm like, don't apologize. You speak English way better than I speak Chinese. You speak way better English than I speak Russian. So no apologies necessary. I wish I could speak your language as well as you speak mine.
I think also the trick is to have tools. So for example, what happened is I was going to start teaching classes, and I was really afraid that, because every now and then, and it still happens, and it will probably happen for the rest of my life, there's times in which my brain just flips out and I move to Spanish, or I just completely forget the word in both languages. Like, my brain just kind of like makes, like, something just breaks in there in the process of speaking a different language. And apparently it's very common with anyone who speaks more than one language. And I was like, I'm really afraid that I'm going to start teaching something and my English will I always say that my English collapses, like my English will collapse and they will think that I don't know what I'm doing. And I think my boss is from Russia. So my boss was like, look, the first thing that you do, I don't remember if it was my boss or my husband. Someone was like, look, the first thing that you need to do is say like, by the way, English is not my first language.
Yeah.
So just so you know. Right? And every now I make fun of it. So there will be times in which like, I need you to move your foot wrist. Yes, your foot wrist. You know what I mean. So just do it, right? Go with it. Or I will like kind of like do things like that and people just roll with it. And it's also made me much more comfortable with that matter. And funny enough, it also, I've noticed that it makes people who are not Americans or who's not their first language either to also feel much more cool with being in there because they see my struggle and they're like, oh, we're in the same page. So I don't have to feel shy about it because we are both struggling the same to communicate. And it eases kind of like the way with them.
Well, I do want to say that as a native-born English speaker, I do the exact same thing. So what I tell all my guys is, listen to what I mean, not what I say.
That's perfect. I love it.
You started a group called Esfinges. Did I say that right?
Yes.
What is that group? You've mentioned it before. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and what the plan for that group is?
So Esfinges is an international woman Hema network. It's a little bit complicated to sort of like, well, not complicated, but it's a little bit tricky to explain how it goes. But our main goal, we have two main goals. The first goal, and is the main reason I started it was try to understand why and what causes for it to be so few women in Hema, right? What is it that makes it so hard for women to join? What is it that makes it so hard for women to stay? And what is it that it makes it so hard for women that stay to prepare to completely like develop and go into like coaching, teaching positions, right? Because it's also very common for a lot of women who've been doing it for years to kind of like stagger at practitioner level when there's no reason for it, including people who have the wish to move forward for that and they don't. The second goal was to create a place where women could find other women to discuss fencing, right? The idea from this came from the understanding that there's not very many of us. A lot of us are the only one in the club, and there's things that you might not feel comfortable talking to your coach, right? Or that, again, with all this story that being a woman shouldn't matter, but it ends up being a thing. Be a place where you don't have to explain these background for people to understanding, and you just can go and be, and without having to give any explanation, everyone understands any possible baggage that might have come to you out of just wanting to do Hema. So it becomes a very easy space to get to know people, to get encouraged, and to kind of like support each other to build up to a better, more skilled Hema community, so to speak.
Yeah, it's an amazing organization. Can you give us the website for it?
Yes, so you can find us at esfinges.net.
And I'm going to put that in the description of the video.
Okay.
Perfect. We've got everything that we need right there. And I love your logo. Thank
you. It's actually funny. When we first started, I made a poll for people to decide the logo. I designed it, that one. It was a polemic logo, but I'm in love with it. I'm really proud of it.
Is Esfinges open to women that study other martial arts as well?
So we do have people who practice other martial arts, but our main focus is Hema. So we have SEA people, we have people who do archery, we have people who do, oh my God, what's the name of it? Filipino.
Eskrima?
Eskrima, yeah, we have several people that do Eskrima, but our forum is actually fully focused on Hema. We actually had a process of trying to decide on this matter, and the truth is, there's so much we could cover, and I felt like when I try to cover everything, I was unable to really pay attention to it. So there we have other people there, and they're always welcome, and it's always a blast to have different minds and different opinions, but our main focus it's purely on Hema.
Nice. I would love to get one of your patches.
You can just tell me the address and I'll send it to you.
There's been a lot of social change in our country recently, where minority groups are coming to the forefront and starting to get more recognition. And June is Pride Month.
Yes.
And talking about Hema drama earlier, do you have transgender women as members of FNGs?
We do. It was actually an interesting talk because our goal is women, and so we have women, cis, and transgender. We debated for a long time whether we should include non-binary and if we should include trans men. And again, the reason is like, what is our goal and how much can we help? So at the end of the day right now, Sphinx welcomes trans women, cisgender women, and usually what we do is when trans men join us is we invite them to other sites that are directed at queer, trans, and LGBT community. So that way we kind of like each of our groups can focus on our topic, so to speak. And we actually usually also invite, obviously, non-binary people to those clubs. But we do focus on women, but yes, we welcome cis and transgender women.
Very cool. You just wrote a blog entry that hit me and a lot of other people very strongly. And you gave me permission. I shared it with my group as well. And one of the things that just stuck out to me is your first couple lines. I am a woman. I want a fence. You've told us about some of your challenges in that, but then a couple paragraphs down, and this is something I deal with in my school because I currently have 3 chapters of my school and getting ready to open up a 4th. But of the 3 current chapters, one of them is run by a woman in Texas, and the 4th one's going to be run by a woman as well,
cool.
Up in Alameda. And I work with a lot of women in my school. But one of your lines is, I start the class, I'm new, I'm slow, it's okay, I'm learning. But why? Why is this not working? I feel boob. Boob? Can I say boob? And it's such a foundational difference that men don't understand. When I teach quarterstaff, I have a certain way I hold it and the way I teach people to hold it. But I have small women, I have large women. So I actually tell them, and one of my ladies came up with this line, hold your staff at boob width.
Oh, that's great.
Because whether you have a small-chested woman or a large-chested woman or a large man, as soon as I start trying to do this, my body gets in the way. And that's something that you and every other woman has had to deal with that men don't, generally. And of course, there are some men that do.
Yeah.
But this blog entry that you wrote just really hit me with all of the things that I do and all of the women I work with. And thank you for writing that. And more importantly, I know there's a lot of women that I saw respond were like, thank you for putting my thoughts into words.
So I think one of the things that I want to point out from there, though, is like, I think what people don't realize, and maybe this is more like my advice to instructors, right? I think one of the things that happen is that first, in a community where it's mostly men, I think male instructors don't think about dealing with different physiques, right?
Yeah.
The second one is like, it's not like it's not in many places, it's still not socially acceptable to talk about our bodies like this.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable. So women many times won't just go forward to tell you this. And if you arrive personally and be like, hey, are your boobs in the way? This is how you fix it. It's going to be like, whoa, like, no, right? Like, it's just not going to fly. Yeah. So for example, one of the things that I think that it's important for instructors to acknowledge is how to openly talk to people about how to deal with physical things. And as you say, like, there's men who deal with, as we call the man boobs, right?
Yeah.
It's a thing. And people, the fact that instructors don't just mention it as a fact through class affects. So one of the ways that I fixed it is, you're going to do this position. Now, for some people, large-chested, you will have this issue feel in the way, right? It could be because of A, B, or C. This is how you fix it. So I'm relieving the stress of my fencers to have to come forward with these uncomfortable conversations, and I'm normalizing these conversations. And what I intended so my goal when I wrote that is to guide you through the experience of being a Hema fencer, right? And how things that you never even thought that were going to be in a brain start popping up in there and start seeding feelings that are not necessary for your fencing, or that are not necessarily helpful to your fencing. And that particular one is that kind of like spot of like, there's things that are pertaining to me based on how my physique works that I don't feel comfortable asking, but my coach is also not aware of it. And what happens many times is also, you don't have boobs, so how are you going to understand, right? Like, there's not a good conversation of it. And I figured out that normalizing those conversations. So when I start doing this, my there's male instructors in my club too. Some of them starting kind of like picking up these things, or they will be like, refer them to the female coach so they can talk about those subjects. And I will even be things like, we're fencing and it's like, oh, by the way, we're gonna do this exercise, take it light. I will sometimes talk about it like, there's hormonal processes, right? Sometimes you're gonna feel down. And I have this story. There was this one girl, I was scoring for one of my coach's classes, a rapier class, and a girl just came back and she was feeling really dizzy. So it was like, it's fine, just sit down. And you could see her that she was really down, but she was also kind of like pale and acting a little bit like crampy, right? And I talked to her, I looked at her, it's like, and I obviously say this aside, it's like, look, this is none of my business, but just so you know, it happens sometimes during a certain part of your period, you will get a lot of dizziness because there's just a lot of blood moving on the way, right? And I was like, and sometimes also, because she was like, I just don't understand where this is coming from. And it's like, I don't know if this is your current situation, but if you change of hormonal treatment, or if you're having like a very bad time of the month, and that happens to be happening right now, that might be an explanation of what out of nowhere this happened. And her eyes lit like, oh, this actually was happening right now. Like, I never thought that would affect my fencing. And I was like, of course it does. And she immediately stopped caring.
Yeah.
And she was like, I thought I was the worst. It's like, no, you're in a moment when it's not great. Like, it happens, right? And when coaches kind of like normalize having just these conversations of the open, it just kind of like, you don't even have to go through that discomfort.
Right. And one of the things that you said that I really enjoyed is, you said this aside. And that's another big thing, is we need to normalize these conversations, but we don't need to do it loud and proud in the middle of the class, because that draws all the attention and could make it even more challenging and stressful in that moment.
Depends on the topic. Like, I think it's important to talk a bit out loud so guys understand, in the terms of like, look, if your classmate is telling you, I need to go slow today, you don't need to know the reason, but now you know that there's valid reasons for it. So you need to be aware of it. But I will never single out a student in class, because then that's embarrassing and that's a problem that will definitely make them quit. So I think
what I was talking about.
Yeah, kind of like there's a balance of of when and why, so to speak.
One of the things I do, because I work on Fjord, we have woman's guard. And for a guy, we just sit here. This doesn't work for a woman because that puts her elbow out here.
Yeah.
So learning how to manipulate the body gives us the ability to look at each individual and tailor their training to their body. There's a book, I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called, oh shoot, I just did it again. See, it's not you. There's a book, I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called The Armored Rose.
I have not.
It's a fantastic book written by a woman who fought heavy in the SCA. And it's looking at the physiological as well as the emotional and psychological differences between male and female in the fight. And this is actually the book that really started my desire to want to understand more about the differences. And it's one that I would highly suggest because it does help a lot. And you have a perspective I will never have. But this got me started in seeing some of the differences.
I'm definitely gonna look for it because this is the truth though. I'm 4'11", I'm really short, right? And I'm used to deal with my physique, so I can relate to certain other women's, but I think no one can ever live in the shoes of someone else. So even then, I think we all, as coaches, like we still need to find ways to understand other body, because it also happens to me. You could even say with men, right? Because there's things that I have to adapt when I'm teaching that a guy doesn't have to.
Yeah, yeah.
So it I guess it makes it, we have the same situation both ways.
Yes, we do. If you could talk to your younger self when you were first starting out in Hema study, what advice would you give that younger Perica?
3 things. Don't dwell on it. You won't make everyone happy. And don't allow people to underplay your skills. And if they tell you they only pay attention because you're pretty, you can always answer, jealous or what? I think those would be the three main things.
And those are good for everybody.
Yeah, I started as a teenager I was 16, 17, and I think I downplayed myself a lot. I would not give kind of like, I think you should be humble, but as you were telling me earlier, you should not downplay your efforts. And I think I did that for a long time. And I think I let a lot of people question my place in fencing that made me slower to grow, and that up to date, it made me a very and I'm not happy to say this, but I'm kind of like I require a lot of maintenance, so to speak, in order to keep myself going. Like I need friends to be constantly reminding me like, no, you're good, just do it. Yeah. I think it's important to rely on people. I just wish I didn't have to be that heavy on needing reliance at times. And if someone had told me, like, look, everyone who's tearing you down is not going to move from there, and you will, it might have probably just speed up a lot of the improving process much faster.
Those are really good pieces of advice. I think that's a good advice, not just for anybody who's starting their Hema study, but now. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got, and as an instructor, and I've been doing this a long time, I'm supposed to be good. What do you mean I got beat?
Oh.
And the best thing I ever heard was, even monkeys fall out of trees. And
that's a very good one.
Now, I have one last question for you, Perica, and I like to ask this of my friends that I've known for a while. What is a memory that you have of something where we were together, we were doing something, or something of us?
A memory of us. The first one that comes to my brain is a really ridiculous one.
Oh, even better.
We were at a Hema event, and I think we were discussing something about you being strong because of armor. And I was like, oh, I can pick everything. So you grab a friend on one side of me and you just lift us up. And you were like, we were each on your shoulders. And it was like, what is happening? That's one of my most vivid memories up to date.
That was my recreation of Andre the Giant. He has a famous photo of him holding up people on each arm, and I wanted to do that. And
I still have the picture somewhere. I don't know where, but I know that the picture still exists.
I have a copy of it too.
Yes! That's awesome.
This has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Perica. And I think for me, the memories that stick out in my head are you guys gave me little tiny river cockroaches to put in tacos.
Yes, they're delicious.
That and being completely lost, sitting at dinner one night after the event, and you started talking at like 300 miles per hour in Spanish, and I don't understand Spanish very well. That was like a carpet of language going over me, and I had no idea what was going on. So I think I just sat there at the table and
See, to be fair, even in Mexico, so I'm gonna make this real quick. Perica is a nickname, means parrot, and I earned it at 12 years old because even for a Mexican, I speak way too fast. So I think half of the table was faking that they were understanding me too, even the Mexicans.
For me, it's been amazing to watch your progress from that young lady that I met in Mexico to not just an accomplished fencer, an accomplished teacher, a support system for women all over the world who feel the same kinds of challenges that you not only felt, but worked your way through.
It actually means
It's been amazing. Thank you for spending time with me.
Thank you, and I'm not gonna say anything because you're gonna make me cry, and I'm not joking. No, seriously, thank you.
It's been great, and I look forward to spending more time with you in the future.
I agree. I hope I get to see you soon.
Me too. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
That was great to hear, Perica. I'm sure there's so many women who have gone through the same kind of issues and trials that you have. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us. If you liked what you saw in this interview, please hit the notification button and the subscription button below. We have a lot of interviews on this channel, as well as a lot of videos that go through different techniques with different weapons in historic European martial arts.